My ex-wife forged documents to steal our apartment. I exposed her in court, leaving her homeless. My name is Mark, 35 years old, and if life were a movie, I'd be typecast as the clueless optimist. The guy who always believes the best in people until reality smacks him in the face. But a couple of years ago, my story took a sharp detour. Laura, my ex-wife, 33, wasn't just ambitious. She was ambition personified. The kind of person who sees a ladder and immediately thinks about climbing it, no matter who gets stepped on. We were married for 10 years, a decade that ended in a finale so absurd it could have been ripped straight from the pages of a dark, ironic comic. Her unquenchable thirst for shortcuts and easy riches shattered everything I once held dear and left me scrambling to pick up the pieces. It hadn't always been like that. We were a love story so idyllic it bordered on cliché. Late-night conversations that bled into dawn, trading dreams about building a house with a big porch, getting a mutt we'd name Pepper, laughing until our stomachs hurt. Those were the days when I thought I knew Laura. But as the years rolled on, that picture-perfect vision began to warp. The sparkle in her eye shifted. What was once playful became calculating. Her conversation started to lean more into returns on investment than moments of joy, and her smile, once warm, held a gleam that made me feel like a pawn on a board I couldn't see. I chose not to notice. I clung to the Laura I had first fallen in love with, the one who made pancake Sundays a ritual and sang off-key in the shower. But that Laura was fading, replaced by a version that stared a little too long at our bank statements and dropped names at parties with practiced ease. And I, ever the hopeless romantic, ignored the warning bells that echoed in my head like an alarm on perpetual snooze. After all, love meant trust, didn't it? It meant believing in someone even when they made you wonder if your gut feelings were just paranoia. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. I was standing in my kitchen, scrolling through endless TV show options, the day's monotony settling in, when my phone buzzed. Dan, our mutual friend and the unofficial town crier, had sent a message. "Hey, Mark, did you hear that Laura is trying to pull a fast one with the apartment?" My blood turned to ice, my hands went numb, and my phone slipped through my fingers, splashing into the sink like a stone dropped into a pond. Laura? Legal papers? The apartment we had chosen together, arguing over wallpaper colors and laughing about where to put the dog's bed. I sank into the nearest chair, a cold sweat creeping down my back. It couldn't be true. Laura, the woman who once knew every little thing that made me smile, couldn't have been plotting behind my back. Yet the gnawing in my stomach suggested otherwise. Memories flashed in my mind. The casual questions she'd asked months ago about property rights. The glances she exchanged with strangers that felt like deals being made without a word spoken. It had all been there, plain as day, and I'd refused to see it. And now, as I sat there with my pulse hammering in my ears, one thing was clear. I was done playing the fool. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, so my first instinct was to call my lawyer, Sam. Sam was a legend in his own right, always impeccably dressed, as if he had just stepped out of a courtroom victory, with headlines waiting to be written about him. His voice, usually steady and confident, carried a note that made my stomach clench. "Mark, I've got some bad news," he said, and it was like the ground beneath me gave way. It was true. Every whispered suspicion confirmed. Laura had forged documents, an elaborate lie woven tightly to seize the apartment I called home, the place that was supposed to be my fortress after the fallout of our marriage. And she hadn't done it alone. Of course not. No, she had enlisted the devil in a suit himself, Mr. Richards. He was the kind of lawyer that made even sharks look toothless, known for finding loopholes others couldn't even dream of. Richards didn't just practice law. He twisted it, bent it to his will with the arrogance of a man who knew he'd win before the game even started. If there was a way to turn the blackest night into an illusion of day, Richards would find it while sipping his coffee, a smirk etched across his face. Rage hit me like a fist, doubling me over with its sheer force, only to be followed by a wave of helplessness that made my hands tremble. This wasn't just about money or bricks and mortar. It was about the last semblance of stability I had managed to claw back post-divorce, my sanctuary, The one thing that had given me hope that life could still be rebuilt was now at risk. I sat there staring at my phone's glowing screen, the room eerily silent except for the hum of the fridge in the background, as if mocking my shock. "Seriously, Laura? This is how low you've sunk?" I muttered, the emptiness of the room almost responding in its own dark, cynical way. "What did you expect, buddy?" I started gathering evidence like a detective in a low-budget TV show, driven not just by anger, but by the gnawing fear that this time things could spiral beyond my control. Phone call logs? Check. I scrolled through each one, noting times and dates, cross-referencing with old memories. Emails? Absolutely. I dug deep, past the cordial exchanges, and into the buried threads where hints of her intentions first began to show. Messages? You bet, complete with every sarcastic back and forth and passive-aggressive jab we'd ever exchanged. I was surrounded by stacks of papers, an ancient laptop humming in the corner, and cold coffee that chilled quicker than I could drink it. The room became a war zone of documents and sticky notes scrawled with frantic reminders and half-formed ideas. Nights passed without sleep, each hour punctuated by the hollow thud of my heart and the click of my pen. The more I found, the more anxiety latched on, squeezing tight until I felt like I could barely breathe. But I pushed on, because what choice did I have? Then, amidst the chaos, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. Laura wasn't just relying on forged documents. She had managed to rally witnesses to bolster her fraudulent claims. And who else but her cousin Steve led the charge? The same Steve who'd been her accomplice in more underhanded schemes than I could count on one hand. The guy had a reputation that preceded him, always donning suits that looked like they'd been bought from a last resort for con men sale, complete with a smirk that dared anyone to call him out. It was the kind of discovery that twisted my stomach into knots. This wasn't just a battle over legal documents anymore. It was a theater of lies where I was being dragged into a narrative I never wanted to star in. Steve's involvement meant the game was dirtier than I'd imagined. A web of half-truths and rehearsed stories, ready to trap me at every turn. The pressure mounted as the realization set in. This was no longer a simple case. It was a battlefield, and each piece of evidence was a weapon that needed wielding with precision. The fatigue settled in my bones, the kind that not even adrenaline could shake off. I looked around my living room, now a makeshift command center, with papers stacked high like a fortress of desperation. And one darkly sarcastic thought kept whispering through the exhaustion. Congratulations, Mark. You're no longer just in trouble. You're in a circus where you're the star clown, complete with an audience waiting for the grand finale. I pressed on, knowing that the only way out was through, even if that meant wading through the swamp of deceit Laura had constructed, with Steve's smirking face waiting on the other side. In court, Laura performed with an intensity that would have made any seasoned actor jealous. Tears streamed down her cheeks, as if she'd just witnessed the most heart-wrenching scene in cinematic history, and her voice quivered with so much conviction that even the judge, who'd seen it all, glanced at her with an almost sympathetic frown, as if to say, "What a tragedy." She wove a narrative of how I had been aggressive, and was, in her words, entirely unfit to manage the property. Right, because that apartment was apparently a fortress under constant siege by mythical beasts, and I was just the bumbling idiot who couldn't keep the drawbridge up. I sat at our table, arms crossed, a small, disbelieving snort escaping me. Sam, my lawyer, gave me a sideways glance, his expression somewhere between patience and wait for it. He knew our ace was coming, and when his moment arrived, he seized it with the confidence of a man who had already won the battle in his head. Sam stood up, his voice sharp enough to cut through the murmur of the courtroom, and presented the pièce de résistance, video footage. Clear as day, it showed Laura and her cousin Steve, the one with suits so questionable they practically had a neon fraud sign sewn into the lining, plotting out how they'd take me down. The smirk that Laura had worn like a badge of honor disintegrated instantly, replaced by wide-eyed panic. It was that split-second realization when the cards fall and the illusion shatters. The room collectively held its breath, the air crackling with tension. Someone in the back even muttered, "Oh, now that's a twist," and I couldn't help but think how this courtroom drama had turned on its head. For the first time in weeks, I felt the weight shift, like I was finally catching my breath in the middle of a storm. Laura's gaze darted around, looking for an out that didn't exist. The judge's eyes narrowed, a flicker of disbelief hardening into realization. Sam stepped back, a slight curve to his lips, his victory smile. This was more than just a rebuttal. It was the tipping point, and everyone knew it. Stopping wasn't an option. This battle had to be seen through to the end, and for the first time in what felt like forever, luck was tilting in my favor. Out of nowhere, Brian, one of Laura's former friends, who always looked like he was done with life about 2 days ago, reached out. He came to me with an offer, his eyes carrying the weary look of someone who had watched too many of Laura's games unfold and was ready for them to end. "Man, I don't know how you put up with her for so long," he said, his tone a mix of exhaustion and resolve, as if daring me to bring this circus crashing down. The day he walked into the courtroom, he had a look that screamed, "Let's just get this over with." He took the stand, cleared his throat, and started speaking, and within moments, a ripple of murmurs spread across the room. Brian detailed Laura's love for bragging about bending the rules and dodging the law with a casualness that was almost impressive. "Those laws are for people who can't think outside the box," he said, mimicking her with an eye roll so exaggerated someone in the back actually chuckled. I watched Laura carefully, noting the small twitch in her jaw, the rigid way her hands gripped the edge of the table. The ice under her was cracking, and she knew it. The judge's brows knitted together, deepening with each of Brian's revelations. And then, as if he couldn't stomach any more, he cut Laura off mid-attempt to feign innocence. A firm hand raised to silence her weak protest. Her eyes flickered around the room, looking for an anchor, a way out, but all she found were faces waiting to see the final unraveling of her act. Control, once her greatest weapon, was slipping through her fingers, grain by grain, like sand in an hourglass running out. On the final day of the hearing, I sat there, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on me, wishing it was all just a bad dream I'd wake up from. But reality wasn't that kind. This was a real-life disaster playing out in full color, and I was smack in the middle. One thought kept echoing in my head. Now or never, man. Sam, my lawyer, the undisputed king of tearing arguments apart, stood up with a look that said, "Grab your popcorn, this is going to be a show." He began to present a set of financial documents, not just any papers, but a bombshell with enough force to end Laura's elaborate act. These documents laid it all bare. Income streams, suspicious expenses, and evidence that proved her claims of being financially vulnerable were nothing more than a fabricated sob story. But the real kicker? The clumsy forgery of Laura's signature, so amateurish that even a child could have pointed out the flaws. The room fell silent, the air crackling with anticipation, and Laura's face went pale, like someone caught red-handed. Then the true spectacle began. Laura jumped up, her eyes wild, pointing at me like a frenzied conductor. "He did it! It's all a setup!" she shrieked, her arms flailing as if she might take off any moment. The room buzzed with murmurs, but the judge, clearly done with the theatrics, raised his hand to cut through the noise. He stared at her, eyes weary and unwavering. "Mrs. Laura, that's enough. The decision has been made." I watched as her expression shifted through a range of emotions: anger, disbelief, and finally, pure, unfiltered terror. The kind that comes when the game you thought you had mastered turns against you. And sitting there, watching it all unfold, only one thought came to mind. "So, you like playing chess? Checkmate, sweetheart." The judge's voice cut through the air like a final drum roll, and when he announced the verdict, a wave of relief crashed over me. I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath until that moment. The ruling was in my favor, and it wasn't just a legal victory. It was the culmination of years of frustration, betrayal, and an uphill battle that had pushed me to my limits. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could breathe freely, as if someone had finally cracked a window open in a stifling room. Laura sat across the room, the shock on her face slowly morphing into something darker. This was more than just losing the claim to the apartment. It was losing her last stronghold, the final act in a desperate game that had gone terribly wrong. The courtroom, once a stage for her dramatics, now felt like an arena she could no longer command. Her face drained of color, leaving her looking almost ghostly, as if the last threads of her confidence had been severed. Fake documents and grand tales hadn't won her any sympathy, and now she was left with nothing but the aftermath. Mr. Richards, her ever-smug lawyer with the perpetual air of superiority, was a sight to behold. Normally, he left courtrooms with a satisfied smirk and the aura of a man who owned the room. But today was different. Today, he looked like someone who'd realized too late that he'd bet on the wrong horse. Without his signature smugness, he seemed almost deflated, his sharp suit now a mere costume with none of the power it once held. He slunk out of the courtroom quietly, each step echoing with the defeat he couldn't hide, like a drenched cat after a storm. No one so much as glanced at him. They didn't need to. Everyone knew he had failed spectacularly, and that was a moment worth remembering. Laura, on the other hand, sat rooted to her chair, eyes staring forward, processing the blow that had just landed. Her expression was a silent play in 3 acts. Shock, a flash of rage, and then the cold, bitter realization of what it all meant. I watched as she struggled to pull herself together, a hand twitching as if she wanted to lash out, but couldn't muster the strength. When she finally stood, it was slow and unsteady, like she was trying to convince herself she still had some semblance of control. But it was clear. Control had slipped away, and all that remained was a hollow shadow of what she once was. The room was silent as she made her way to the exit, each step a testament to the defeat she refused to fully acknowledge. Her gaze never met mine, but I could feel the daggers she was mentally throwing, sharp and desperate, and I couldn't help the thought that slid into my mind, darkly satisfying in its finality. So, Laura, how's this for a plot twist? No more forged signatures, no more schemes, just the truth, plain and unforgiving. You'd better start getting used to it. As the courtroom doors closed behind her, the tension lifted like a heavy curtain falling after the final act of a play. I looked over at Sam, who met my eyes with a small nod, a shared understanding passing between us. This was it, the end of a chapter I'd fought tooth and nail to close, and as I gathered my things, the reality sank in. I was finally free. After the trial, I finally took a deep breath. Relief washed over me like a long-awaited vacation after a year of sleepless nights. You know that feeling when a concrete block is lifted off your shoulders? That's exactly how I felt, standing on the courthouse steps, looking at the bustling city that, for the first time in a while, seemed to smile back at me. My life, once a collection of dark anecdotes, began to piece itself back together. First, a normal sleep schedule returned, a victory in itself. Then, I found myself enjoying my morning coffee again, not as a bitter survival ritual, but as a simple pleasure. I even considered swapping out my couch for something more cheerful, like a beanbag chair. You know, to feel more like the star of a rom-com than the tragic hero of a drama. And Laura? She vanished from the scene faster than Black Friday sales. None of our mutual friends or acquaintances knew where she was or what she was up to. It was as if she'd been erased from my life with an eraser. I wouldn't be surprised if somewhere, far away, she was concocting a new plan to reclaim her crown of chaos. But that wasn't my problem anymore. I left her behind like an old rerun I'd grown tired of. Of course, the battle left scars, those small flashes of memory, her chin held high, trying to convince everyone in court of her righteousness, still flitted through my mind. But they weren't as painful, more like mosquito bites, annoying, but not lethal. The most important thing I learned? Justice is possible. Not always quick, not always smooth, but if you hold your ground and push through, life might just give you a wink and say, "You earned this, my friend."